Hello friends, my name is Ajay, one of your TAs for Comp 423, and welcome to part 2 of the Introduction to Angular series. In this video, I'm going to be taking some of the things that you learned in the previous video, including Angular components, and adding on to them. Specifically, you're going to learn how Angular components can access and manage data. First though, let's get started with a little recap of the things that we talked about in the previous video. Specifically, we introduced the Angular framework, which is a front-end web development framework used to make single-page web applications. And we talked about single-page web applications basically being applications that display one page and then dynamically rewrite the page depending on the route that the user navigates to. And this can be summarized in the diagram that you can see here. In Angular, we take these different pages or views and we essentially use components to actually implement them, right? So Angular components are the pages that we see on our application. And then the Angular app routing module is responsible for linking these components to the right route, such that when the user types in a URL into their browser, the correct page shows up. Now, components are great because again, these are the pages on our website. However, as you know, pages on the internet are not static. They aren't empty, right? They convey some sort of information, some sort of data. So how can we get data into our components? And that begins this question of data management. And to get started on this discussion, I want to show you again a sample web page. And this is the same web page that you saw in the previous video, which is the organizations page of the CSXL site. This is available at csxl.unc.edu/organizations. Now, if you notice here, when you press on the organizations page, we see all of these organizations. And these organizations are student-led organizations that are affiliated with the CS department. And so if we're trying to think about data management, the first question that you might be asking, or that you might want to ask, is what is the type of data that we want to convey, or what information do we want to convey on the organization's component? And of course, this might be a bit self-explanatory, right? We are just trying to show organization data. However, there is an interesting question that we might have, right? Which is, how do we represent an organization in TypeScript, right? Because remember, TypeScript is the programming language that we are using to write our application. We have Angular as a framework on top of it, but ultimately we are writing in TypeScript code. So if we're trying to, work with organization data and display organization data on our page, how do we actually represent this data in TypeScript? And the answer is that we can use TypeScript interfaces. And again, if you already read the TypeScript reading, we do talk about the differences between classes and interfaces and how you use them in TypeScript. If you are not familiar with that, especially the syntax, I'll highly recommend checking that out. Now, this is an example TypeScript interface. As you can see, to create this, we use the interface keyword and then the name of the interface that we are trying to create. In this case, organization. Right? We're trying to create some sort of model, some sort of entity in our TypeScript code that we can use to represent organizations so that we can work with organization data and display it on our site effectively. Now, one thing you'll know as well is that there's a new keyword that has been added here, which is the export keyword. And the export keyword is something that you will find a little bit more regularly inside of an actual project. However, when you add export, we're essentially making this interface available to the other TypeScript files in our application. So I can have an organization.ts file, for example, that contains this interface, but then by adding export, another file next to it will be able to use this organization interface. And this is, of course, very important because, when you're, for example, in your organization's component and you need to access this interface that we're creating, we want to be able to import it from the organization page. And so adding export allows us to do that. Now, when we're working with interfaces, or even with classes for that matter in TypeScript, as you know, this is essentially what is going to be eventually defining some sort of object, right? And all of our objects have properties, right? If we're trying to model an organization, like our organization data has properties that it needs to store. This might be many things, such as the organization name, right? What is the name of the organization that you're trying to represent in your code? In addition, your organization may have some sort of description attached to it. For example, right, Hack and See might have a description saying that we are the largest hackathon, etc. AI Club's description might be that we talk about artificial intelligence and its social impacts and how to code with them, etc. In addition, we may have more metadata such as year founded. What is the year that this organization was created? When did it start? And then lastly, we may have for example, a list of events that are commonly hosted by the organization. And in this case, we can say that this is going to be a list of strings. We'll just have the name of the event as a string, just for simplicity. Now, using an interface here might be a little bit interesting or a little bit peculiar to you. If you remember from your earlier classes like Java, generally interfaces are used, they contain methods, and then it's up to the classes that actually implement the interface to, choose the fields, etc. However, in this case, in TypeScript, we're going to have the fields listed out in our interface. And the reason behind this, right, and the reason that we use interfaces over something like a class is that interfaces just specify the properties we expect, right? It just specifies the shape. If we were to create, for example, a TypeScript class, we would need many other things such as the constructor, maybe methods, etc. And in this case, all we're trying to do is model the type of data that we're going to be working with, which in this case is organizations, right? We don't need a constructor. We don't need all of these fancy things. The only thing that we want to be able to do is say, okay, well, what data does an organization need to store, right? Like what data is associated with an organization? And this works as well because of the structural typing system that TypeScript uses. If you're familiar with Java, you know that you can't just create an object out of a interface type in Java. You need to create an object out of some sort of implementing subclass. But remember, TypeScript uses structural typing. So what does that mean? Well, this is actually an organization object. This is creating an organization object in TypeScript. And you'll notice that this is really strange, right? So here we have let CSXL, which is a variable. We have the type of our variable, which is organization. And then we set it equal to this collection of items inside of curly braces. And in TypeScript, when you have curly braces and then you have, properties like this is known as an object literal, right? So I'm essentially constructing an object by including this opening and closing brace or curly bracket. And within these curly brackets, I essentially have 4 fields. I have 4 properties. I have name, description, year founded, and events. And you can see that for CSXL, I have CS Experience Labs as the name, Awesome as the description, year founded is 2023, and I put a sample workshop as a commonly hosted event. Now, why is this even valid, right? You might be wondering, because from the Java world, this looks odd. You'd have to, in Java, write like organization, CSXL equals, and then new organization. And then you'd have this constructor where you put in all of your fields, right? And this works because of structural typing. Remember that in TypeScript, right? TypeScript determines that 2 objects are of the same type based off of the properties that they hold, based off of its shape, right? So for example, if I'm creating an object that has the 4 fields name, description, year founded, and events, and we said that an organization object, as we see by this, in this interface, needs a name, description, year founded, and events, that is essentially the same shape. And therefore, TypeScript is going to find that this random object we created and our interface organization are the same. That's the same shape. And so therefore, we can say, that the CSXL variable, which is of type organization, can be, validly assigned this object. And so this is a weird thing to think about because, again, in Java, you don't create objects, of interfaces directly. And you can't even do that with normal TypeScript. Like if I said new organization, that's not going to work. You have to use this object literal syntax. And again, this is all valid due to structural typing. Now, one quote that is in the reading that Professor Jordan added, which I think is great, is the quote that, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. Now, how is this relevant to any of this? It's relevant because, if an object, like if this object here, that the CSXL object, looks like an organization, it has the same properties as an organization, has the same shape, then TypeScript will say, okay, this is probably an organization. And so that's why this essentially this variable declaration here is valid. Now, this interface that we created is modeling our organization data, right? It's specifying the structure of our data. And so we call this a model. And we'll be coming back to this terminology a little bit later on. Now, I want to jump in real quick to the actual repo that we used the project that we used in the previous video, and I want to show you this interface implemented in our code. All right, everyone, we are back in VS Code. And as you can see, we have this new file that we created called organization.model.ts. Now, you don't need to name it organization.model.ts. However, this is a standard convention. If you notice in Angular, we have a lot of these file names where we have our file name and then dot, for example, in this case, component, and then the file extension. And this is just convention for us to be able to understand what all of these files are doing. Like, for example, these three files that we worked with earlier all have .component in them, so they are a component file, right? Remember, components require a TypeScript, HTML, and CSS file, right? For example, you'll scroll down here, there's something called service, which we'll get to. We saw this app routing is of .module type, or .module, so it is a module file. There's also, there'll be many other types of files in the future. But for now, that's why we've named this organization.model.ts, simply because it follows convention, and when we look at it, we can say, okay, this is a model, right? It's very easy to associate. And this is the exact same interface that we created on the slide. We have four properties that are two are string type, one is a number, and one is an event. All right, so you saw the actual organization model in our code, right? However, this is just a model. So now we know in TypeScript how we can represent organization data. But now, how do we access it, right? Where do we have to go in order to get this organization data? And so I want to point out again my organizations page, right? Because our organization component is one place where we want to use organization data, right? Because this is where we're loading our organizations. However, think about if this is the only place that we want to load this information. What if you notice here, for example, with ACM at Carolina, there's a card on the screen that has the information about the organization, but then there's a details button, right? What if we want to navigate to an organization details page, which shows more information about an organization when you click on it, right? That might be another page that we want to access organization data. Now, let's go even further. What if we have our events page, which shows all of the events that our organizations are hosting, and we need to display some information about our organizations, right? That would be then another page that we access organization data. And so what you find is that there are multiple components, multiple pages that actually might be accessing the same data, right? So it would be relatively unwise to keep all of our data just in the organization component, because other components may need to access that data, right? And so again, the problem that we have, the problem statement, is that we need some sort of place, a centralized source that all of our components can use that access organization data. And the solution to this is something known as the Angular service. Now, let's take an example here. As you can see, these are the three components that I just talked about: the organizations component, organization detail component, and the events component, right? These are three components that are completely separate, three separate pages at different URLs. However, they all access the same data source. And so let's add something called a service, right? Let's say this is the organization service. And our organization service, right, sources all of the organization data to all of our components. And so what we end up having is we have these arrows back and forth between our components and the service, where our components can ask the service for data, and then the service is going to return some data back to the component. It creates this separation between the layer of where we're actually getting and maybe working with our data, and then where we're actually displaying the data, right? We display the data on the components, and then we access the data in the service side. Access meaning if we need to go to the internet to get it, we access it there. If we're storing it locally, we retrieve it locally. That's what I mean by access. And so now the question is, we have this idea of a service, and that the service is going to essentially convey data back and forth between our components. But how do our components actually access this service? And there's this great tool from Comp 301, if you might remember, called dependency injection. And we are going to make our service available to all of our components by injecting it into our components. So the organization service is available to all of the components that need it through dependency injection. I highly recommend checking out the official Angular docs because I think it explains this dependency injection really well. So I'm going to link it in the YouTube description below. Highly recommend you check it out, and I think it's a really good read to kind of gain some intuition about what is happening here. But I am going to jump into the code as well and show you. Okay. So again, just think about conceptually the separation that we need between our components and our service, because of course, our data can be used by multiple components. So it doesn't make sense for our data source to be in just one component, because otherwise we would need to repeat that code in many different places. So instead, we're going to abstract it out and put it in something called a service. Now, let's jump into Visual Studio Code to take a look at a sample service. All right, everyone, we are now in VS Code. We're back in our project, and we're in a new file called organization.service.ts. Remember, same type of file convention here. Because this is going to be a service, we are going to use the name organization and then .service and then .ts. And the first thing that you'll probably notice here, and I'm going to fix the indenting because I think this is slightly off, is that at the top of the file, we also have a decorator. Remember when we talked about our TypeScript, like our component TypeScript file, we had a @component decorator, all right, for our components. However, for services, we use the @injectable. And if you remember, this is kind of relating back to that entire dependency injection thing. By marking this with the @injectable decorator, and we're saying provided in root, remember root kind of usually refers to, when we say root directory, it's like the home folder, it's like, the primary contains everything else. When we say provided in root, inside of this injectable decorator, we're saying that this organization service is going to be available to everything in our project by the Angular dependency injection system, right? And so we have our service here, and I'm going to show you how we can actually inject this service into another component. So this is our service class, and it is a class. Just like the component was a class, our services are also a class. And because they are classes, remember that we need a constructor. Even if the constructor doesn't do anything, it does need to be here because we are defining a class. However, now we can have fields and we can have methods. And remember that the service's main purpose is to, access data and then give data back to our components to use. So in this case, we're not going to the internet, we're not doing anything fancy in terms of getting organization data, but I've stored a sample array of organizations. I have added two, one for CSXL and one for CADS. And you can see that using that same object literal syntax that we talked about, I've defined two organizations. And you can see that this is valid because these organization object literals have the same four fields, have the same four fields that are expected inside of our organization model, which you can see right here, right? So I've added two organizations, and this is available in this field. And then here we've added a a public getter method that's just all organization data. And I'll call this maybe get all organization data just for, to make this a little bit more familiar with what you all are used to in Comp 301, just for the time being. That returns my list of organizations, and it just returns this organizations field right here. And so this is the method that our components can use to access organization data. Now it is time to actually use this data, right? And so let's go back to this organization component, which is, where we are generally supposed to show our organization data. And as you can see here, the only thing we did was we had this say hi, where if we pressed our button on our page, again, this is in the last video, but when we press say hi, it printed out this hello world. But now instead, what if I want to print out my list of organizations when I press this button? Well, the first thing is, how do I actually access my service, right? How do I even have access to the service? How do I inject the service into my component? And the cool thing is that we can actually use the constructor to do so. So in my constructor, all I have to do is I can create a parameter here that takes in an organization service object. I can call this, for example, public. I could even call this protected. You can use really any modifier you want here. Well, that's not entirely true, but just for the sake of this example, I'll make this public. In the future, though, when you're working in projects, you might want to use protected or private depending on your use case. So I can say organization service, and you can see that because this is a parameter, I'm going to use the normal, casing convention where the first word's lowercase. And then this will be organization service, right? And we can import it, and VS Code automatically imports it for us. And just by adding it to our constructor, we have actually already injected this service into our component, which is super cool. And you might be wondering, wow, that's really strange because, I have this as a parameter here, but, nothing happens, right? It doesn't get saved to anything. And this is actually a really cool TypeScript feature that when you define a parameter in your constructor, if you don't do anything else, essentially, TypeScript will view this. It will take the input that the user puts into the constructor and then make it a field. So when I have this organization service, parameter in my constructor, and I don't really do anything with it explicitly, TypeScript automatically makes this a property of my class. And I can show you because I can type now this dot, and you'll notice that organization service is actually a drop-down item. Right? This is a property of our organization's component object. I can press enter, and now I have access to my organization service. So all I have to do now is if I want to print out my list of organizations, in my console.log, I can just say this.organization service dot, and then you can see get all organization data. And I can just make this, I can call this method, and that is it. Right? So this is really, really cool because, it looks almost like magic because you're like, okay, well, I have this component and I don't know where this component is being called. I have this constructor. I don't know where the constructor is being called, but magically I have access to a service and I'm able to, just use any methods, like use this getter method. And again, even though it looks like magic, there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes that you don't really need to be aware of, really the inner workings of it. However, this is all working because of Angular's dependency injection system. If I didn't mark my class with this injectable decorator, then we wouldn't have the service automatically loaded when this component loads. Because this is an Angular component and it's marked with this at component, Angular knows that it's a component, and so it's going to find anything that is in its constructor, and it's going to try and automatically fill it with what is injectable. And so I mark my service as injectable, I've marked my component with that component, and so therefore when this application is loading, the service is going to just be automatically injected, and Angular is going to do that for us. So now let's try and run this in our browser. So I'm just going to type ng-served into my terminal window here, and you will see that it's going to build my application. All right, this is compiled successfully, so we can jump over to our web page. I'm going to go into my organizations page right here. And actually, one thing is, if you remember from the last video, in my router, I actually changed, in my organization component, I changed my route to 123. I'm going to remove that so that I can actually access it from the sidebar. There we go. Right. And so now when I go to my inspector, and of course I'm using a Safari, but you can use anything else, and I open my console and I press the Say Hi button, you will see that in my output, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger here. There we go. You can see in my output when I press this button, and I'll press it again, that we have two objects being printed out in a list. And I can expand this, and you can see that both of my organization objects have been printed out, which is super cool. So now, using this service, my organization component has access to the organization data. Now, in addition, this doesn't just have to be the organization's component. This can also be in, for example, my events component. I can do the exact same thing in my events component if I open up my component and, let's say I want to access organization data here too. No problem. All I have to do is type public organization service, set this to type organization service. Angular handles the rest with dependency injection, and then I can simply console log this output. I will use a ng-on-init function, and ng-on-init is available on components, and I will just use this. Basically, ng-on-init runs once the page actually finishes loading on the browser, and so this is why I want to console log in this so that we can see all of our data. In addition, I'm using ng-on-init because I want to show you that I can again access the service outside of the constructor. And so if I run this, we'll see if this compiles, which it does. And now if I go to my events page, you will see when I navigated to it that both of my organization events show up. All right, everyone, that was quite a lot, but I hope that you can see how powerful Angular services are in enabling multiple components to load data and to display it properly. Now, in this review section, again, you've already seen this diagram from the previous video where it had the Angular components and app routing module, but now's the fun part. We get to add on to our diagram. And the first thing I'm going to add is the Angular service. As you can see, Angular Services has been added to this diagram, and there's an arrow going in and out of the component TypeScript file. So first, you can see that the component TypeScript calls the services functions. For example, in our case, get organization data. And then our service is going to respond with some data back to our component, right? So multiple components can call on a services function and then get data back. And that connects the component and the service. And you'll also see there's a note on the other arrow that services are injected into components. So just keep that in mind and how it uses the dependency injection system. And then you also notice that there's an arrow on the right-hand side. And that is a little bit of foreshadowing into a later part of the course, where services can actually be used to get data across the internet. And that is where services really shine and where they become really, really useful. And so just to tease that, there are two arrows going in and out of the service on that side. And so we've added services, but you notice that there's a little spot in the bottom left where we can add something to our diagram. And the last thing I'm going to add is our data models. This is the interface that we created to represent our organization data. And as you can see, our models define the structure of the data that our services, as well as our components, expect to work with. And so it's really important that you understand how all of these pieces connect together. One of the biggest pieces of advice I could recommend for Comp 423 in general is that there's so many different moving parts, whether that be Angular, especially with these components and services, and then more things as we add on throughout the course, both in the front end and then even in the back end. I highly recommend maybe trying to draw this diagram out for yourself and to really think about how do all of these pieces connect together? How does the data flow from one thing to another? And if you're able to understand this diagram and understand the full diagram once we get to it, then most of the course material will become a lot easier, and it will become easier for you to kind of conceptualize how your program is working, what your code is being used for, and even in the future will help with debugging errors as well. All right, everyone, that is all I have for this video. If you have any questions, again, feel free to find us in our office hours. We host office hours 5 days a week. You can also leave a comment below if you have any recommendations, for future topics that you'd like to cover, or if you have a question. If you like the video, feel free to like it on YouTube. And thanks for watching. See you all in the next one.